compare it with the development of our mental categories to interpret the world than our ways of thinking. And this process has been considerably accelerated during the last 100 years through the rise of party bureaucracies. It can be shown that no other human ability has suffered to such an extent by the progress of the modern age. The relentless process of more and more, bigger and bigger, all of which were supposed to serve the political needs of modern mass societies in order to make representative government possible where direct democracy would not do. We do not know where these developments will lead us, but we can see how cracks in the power structure of all but the small countries are opening and widening. That every decrease of power is an open invitation to violence. I assure you, for your own well-being, it's very unpleasant to live under a dictatorship or a tyranny or a one-party dictatorship, but it is paradise compared to living under a totalitarian dictatorship.
Good afternoon and welcome back to the last panel session of today, which will look at technology and participation as tools to support and strengthen democracy and democratic resilience. It's a real pleasure to co-host this session as a representative of the Egmont Institute. My name is Warten Doven. I'm an associate fellow of Egmont. And it's also a blessing to come after so many brilliant interventions, because I could throw my prepared statement in the garbage bin, because I can't go beyond what has already been said. I think the scene is very clear. There is an urgency to have these conversations, and now I'm also privileged to be surrounded by practitioners and a policymaker who will give some thoughts on what can be the tools in strengthening and renewing our democracy. But before we go to these presentations, interventions, I'm also happy to introduce Nicole de Wandre, Associate Fellow as well at the Egmont Institute, previous commission official and a visiting scholar at several institutions. She has a presentation prepared on addressing the root causes of the crisis of democracy through an Arendtian lens. Nicole, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. No, so I don't know where my PowerPoint is.
One more.
Yes, This is Anthony. Sorry.
Oh,
okay. Sorry. Okay, didn't work. Okay, I can start without it, but I will really need it. If
Christoph will make sure it's
good. Thank you. Yeah, so I was I've been a civil servant for 40 years, entered the commission in 1983 and stepped out last year. And I started reading Arendt in the beginning of 2000s. And I must say that this was really vital for me to stay alive in the European Commission. And I want to explain why. I think that she says, for example, in this interview that I think we saw an extract in the video, there's an interview of Ghost to Arendt. And she says, goes ask, do you want to achieve extensive influence with these works? Or do you believe that such influence is no longer possible in these times? Or is it simply not important to you? He asked Arendt. And she replies, you know, that is not a simple question. If I am to speak very honestly, I would have to say, when I am working, I am not interested in how my work might affect people. And I find that this indifference for how she will be perceived, meaning the trust that we can perceive as we wish, but she wanted to be true to her opinion, as Roger Berkovich just said. I found this confidence in herself very important, and that contrasted with the many minutes, not to say hours, we spend in wondering what is the impact of policies. And when we think that the effectiveness of a policy is to be measured by anticipating its impact on people and things. Okay, so that was the first. And when you are finished, ask goes. And then Arendt says, then I am finished. But then she goes on. What is important for me is to understand. And there I must say that reading her made me understand as well. So the importance of understanding for her as a writer really is contagious for the reader. And so then she writes, for me, writing is a matter of seeking this understanding, part of the process of understanding. So she writes to understand. And she ends up saying, certain things get formulated. Good. We are there. Right. And then oopsie, okay, certain things get formulated. And this is indeed also what reading her brings. So I was looking for an image to represent what the reading of Arendt provoked in me. And it was this sort of joy of a spring. I had also a volcanoes image, but volcanoes are too damaging when you lie around. But this, it's an image of geyser that I took myself in Ireland. This control eruption of joy, and I'm pleased to see that joy is a theme of the next Barth conference in October, is really what I felt reading Arendt regularly. So I will try to share with you by using some citations, I hope not too much, to see if you have the same aha effect when you read her words. Certain things get formulated. Okay, before going to the word of Arendt herself, I thought, okay, I read less people about Arendt than Arendt directly. But I went to read these two books to see if my reason for considering Arendt important resonated with theirs. So Lindsay Stonebridge and Richard Bernstein has wrote these two books very recently. And let me share with you a sentence out of Lindsay Stonebridge's book where she says, Hannah Arendt has been tracking the development of the mindset that has led at worst to totalitarianism and at best insipid democracy. And I have to say that from 2000 to now, Arendt was relevant to me because of her analysis to insipid democracy, much more than what she has to say about totalitarianism, which is also important. But I think we would be wrong or take only the head of her, the tip of the iceberg, if we look only at what she says about totalitarianism without understanding why this has deep root into insipid democracy and what it has become. So what about Bernstein? He cites this part. So he also goes toward this idea that Arendt is interesting not only for what she says about totalitarianism, but about this darkness that comes when the light is extinguished by credibility gaps. And I think we will all admit that our line to take have credibility gaps regularly, and invisible government by speech that does not disclose but what is, but sweeps it under the carpet, by exhortations, moral and otherwise, that under the pretext of upholding old truths, degrade old truths to meaningless triviality. And I think that indeed often in this environment, I have had this impression of meaningless triviality because we repeat words that has no grip on reality. And this is something we need to interrogate. So then, in the words of Bernstein himself, she's an astute critique of dangerous tendencies in modern life. And so I said, oh, oof, I'm not wrong that I read that in her work as well. and she illuminates the potentialities for restoring the dignity of policy. So now don't look for a recipe. This is never a recipe, but indeed, I think she provides a lot of very good material to restore dignity to politics. So next is, what did I find particularly interesting in Arendt's work to understand the crisis of democracy? Because I think we can say it is a sort of crisis of democracy, even if I very much agree with what Roger Berkowitz said yesterday, that it may be challenged in Libre Book. But, so I would have put it quote unquote if I had done the PowerPoint after having heard him. So we have democracy. On the one side, the problem is that the political game is about calculus instead of judgment too often, and to get majorities to make compromise. But the problem of compromise is sometimes we think that what goes together as words or a sentence on a paper, it's okay, everybody find their little eggs into the paper, but when you read it from outside, it just makes no sense. So this oxymorical compromise, I call it, we shouldn't be surprised that they make no sense for people looking at us acting together. So the problem of the normal political game, I would say, is that it is too much pervaded by calculus. Is it my interest or not? Can I give this or not? What do I get in exchange? And oxymorical compromise. And with that, we lose meaning, the meaning of what we do, the meaning of the outcome of this game. The second problem is when we are aware of this problem of oxymorical compromise, we say we should be coherent. We should have one big voice. We should have more political will. And then we aspire to full coherence. This often comes from the Green movement, of not the Greens as a political party, but when we are frustrated with these calamities of action, as she says, we would hope for something which then start to look as totality, and then there is a loss of plurality, because then politics is seen only as a means to an end and not as the practice of action, which it is. So I think that democracy for the moment is squeezed between the loss of meaning and the loss of plurality. And that ends up to a loss of reality. So I suggest to call this a sort of triple loss of our democratic system for the moment: loss of meaning of the outcome, loss of plurality, and loss of reality. And this is why I'm hurted when people and media, especially media, condemn the European Union when people do not agree, when member states disagree. Dissent is never respected at the EU level. We say we only deserve to exist if there is consensus and if there is and if we are a bloc, as Politico calls us. So going back to Arendt after that short analysis, is when she read the Pentagon Papers, she wrote this Home to Roost piece, and she found out that the terrible truth to be gleaned from the story told in these Pentagon Papers was that the only permanent goal had become the image itself, which was debated in countless memoranda and options, that is, in the scenarios and their audience, the very language borrowed from the theater. So the goal of politics is not for everybody to reveal their own identity to others, but to control the image that they project, which of course cannot work, but they can try. And it is interesting because this sentence was put forward this morning, but where I am very struck by where words are not empty. Power is actualized only where words are not empty. And the problem is that indeed, if politicians, political leaders are obsessed by controlling their image, they lose the relevance of their action for others and those looking at them. Now, because when you are trapped in the seeking in controlling your image, the price you pay for trying to control your image, even without succeeding it, is remoteness from reality. And this is what she wrote there in this Lying in Politics paper always. It is this remoteness from reality that will haunt the reader of the Pentagon Papers who has patience to stay with them to the end. Richard Barnett, in the essay I mentioned above, I forgot what it was. I'm sorry, no, this should not. So let's stop at to the end, yeah. So to some extent, reality is like the trees of a the roots of a tree that make the pavement explode at one moment in time, even if the force of each cell within these roots is surely not so great. But there is something that at one moment in time goes beyond what you want to project on reality. So I also want to flag this sentence: when the facts come home to roost, let us try at least to make them welcome. Let us try not to escape into some utopias, image theories, or sheer follies. And I think that today, the mainstream politics sometimes should make facts welcome instead of escaping into the utopias or the ideal that it wanted to be for itself. That's why I think this sentence is relevant now. And the thing also I want to say is this: the texture of reality. She has beautiful stuff on the event. Here is just a very short part of sentence saying the event constitute the very texture of reality, meaning the reality is not just an addition of fact. Reality is not truth and is not factual truth, is more than that. It is, and comes here, it is something that you cannot grasp with reason. Reason's aversion to contingency is very strong because reality is contingent. And we don't like that because we think that reality can be approached with reason and knowledge. But what she says, Arendt, is that reality becomes something, and it could be otherwise because it depends from what we do at each moment. So reason's aversion to contingency is very strong, she says. And just to say that the way she laughs about this game theory and all the what we are doing in the commission, what is called again, impact assessment. So when she said that the enumeration of usually three options, A, B, C, represents the opposite extremes. So she saw that in the 70s already coming. And then she ends up concluding the fallacy of such thinking begins with forcing the choice into mutually exclusive dilemma. Reality never presents us with anything so neat as premise for logical conclusion. You mean left? I'm sorry. I thought it was. Oh, no, because the beginning without. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay, so sorry. So two golden nuggets from Arendt. Now I go to what she brings. The first part. Now I think these two concepts that we heard about this morning. This concept, natality, is about the fact that we are born. I heard Roger Berkowitz saying we should be ready to die for. But I think that I want also to flag the fact that she insists on the fact that we are born beings. And by that, we are beginners. And this determines her way to look at what freedom is about. So freedom is rooted in this ability to begin. Plurality for me is the fact that, in fact, we live among others, men and women, as powerful as we are. Even Trump has peers at his level. There is no one who can escape plurality. Everybody is catched up by a plurality at some point. So plurality is the antidote to omniscience, omnipotence, but that doesn't mean that you are impotent. It is this in between. So the plurality is that we are equal and unique at the same time. So we are not only unique, but we are equal in kind, and we have identities who reveal itself by the way we speak to others. Sorry. So contingency and amor mundi, for me, are what comes out of these two concepts that Arendt posed there on the table. With plurality and natality, she allows us to come to terms conceptually with contingency instead of being frustrated with contingency, and amor mundi by accepting the fact that we are not omnipotent and the world wouldn't be a better place if we were only one. Now, with that, you look at freedom with different mind, with different eye. She redefined common words. That was also very useful for me as a civil servant. And I only will switch to the second, which is shorter. If men wish to be free, it's precisely sovereignty they must renounce. You cannot seek domination and be free at the same time. And then let me focus on that extract from On Revolution, where she said that seeking abundance is to stay trapped in the bonds of necessity, we can be made of silk and not only of iron, meaning those who want to be rich once they have enough choose to stay slaves. And this way to look at rich people is very interesting, because the way we look at rich people often is that they are very, very powerful. Here she tells us these are people that cannot make the choice for freedom. That's a very interesting way to show how rich people are, to some extent, psychologically sick and not just successful. Revisiting power, the essence of politics, we think that power is a mechanical force. It is not the case. As we have heard, it is plurality. Power springs from plurality. And I think that's another thing that we need to do. Now, coming to meaning, because it's really a point I want to make, the problem of a lot of political statements is that they are unable to confront reality. And so they speak, but have no grip on reality. And we repeat the same things for decades. I remember rising inequalities, digital divide. These are expressions that are overused again and again without having a grip on reality. So I think meaninglessness reveals this disconnection from reality. And this is very problematic. And meaning is not the fact, is beyond the difference between fact and opinion, and beyond the difference between truth and lies, is something else, which I would say, I skipped the citation, I'm sorry for lack of time. For me, meaning stands at the edge of reality and plurality. Because reality, that's a long citation, there is reality, what reality can be seen differently from different people. No, 3 last slides, I'm sorry, and I'm just rushing. Foregrounding persuasion over conflict. I think we tend to speak always in terms of war. We feel we have an impact when we describe and we are understood as being strong when we say war against poverty, war against virus, war, trade war against terror, all wars. And the only result of this inflation of the word war is that when there is a true war, we don't measure what it is really. So, and Arendt is writing, says in Understanding, words used for the purpose of fighting lose their quality of speech, they become cliché. Too much cliché, I think, in our political speech. And instead, she suggests to woo or court the agreement of everyone else and beware that speech reveals one's identity. So if you speak cliché, you are perceived by your audience as a robot. So the second thing we need to foreground is judgment over calculus. I came to that. And there again, plurality is interesting because when they sit together around the council table, but that applies for the college, the commissioners, the college. If you want to only strategize and calculate, you can hide your cards and as if you were poker players, but then you cannot hide that you are hiding. So anyway, you are seen for what you do in the end. And I took this picture from G1000, thinking of my neighbor on my right, that in fact what matters in that image is that people really listen to each other. So I really hope, and I think that politics would already do a big jump forward if in meetings such as the council and such important meetings, other important meetings, people would listen to each other instead of strategize and try to trap or reach the goal they have before the meeting. So I think reinstating the notion of plurality in such a setting would do a long way. The last here is demonization is anti-political. We use a lot of demonization to say who is right and who is wrong, the we, they, the binary that Christophe was mentioning at the beginning of the day. And I think that when we demonize, we in fact, we take out the nature of the humanness of our adversary. So it is anti-political and it may be useful to put at a distance our own dark side to some extent, but it's not political. And I want to end on this sentence by Arendt, the end of this interview. And now I would say that this venture is only possible when there is trust in people, a trust which is difficult to formulate, but fundamental in what is human in all people. That doesn't mean we need to trust everybody, but we need to trust what is human in all of us. And that is very important. And this is not naivete. This is, I think, the only way out. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks a lot, Nicole. especially also because you mentioned that the work of Hannah Arendt has helped you through your life as a civil servant, and myself also sharing the joy of civil servants in other parts of my life. It's very inspiring to hear this. And with this, and I'll pass the floor to Anthony Zakarzewski, president and co-founder of the Democratic Society. We've had some references to it already, and I'm sure you'll be happy to complement further to it. You'll be speaking on citizen participation, but also some of the opportunities, current shortcomings of everything that's digital and tech in supporting citizen participation and wider. I'll just very quickly for our panelists, as you asked for a timer, if I raise the blue one, you're halfway through your time. If I go for yellow, you have 2 minutes left. If I do the cute pink, you really need to wrap up. And with that, Anthony, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. One of the things that I draw from Arendt's writings is that democracy, to be successful, needs effort. It can't be something that is done just in the same way that you sit back and watch television. It's a lean forward activity, and it also requires a sense of responsibility. It needs effort from us as citizens, but it also needs effort from policymakers. It's sometimes very easy for policymakers, and I was one for 14 years, to sit back in their offices and not engage too much if people aren't complaining about things. And I think the risk from that is that the decisions become increasingly technocratic and become sealed in a Brussels bubble or a Brighton bubble or a London bubble of people who are having very pleasant, very non-challenging conversations with each other and who all come from pretty similar backgrounds. So I think for us, the work at Democratic Society is partly to encourage people to make that effort, but we don't want it to seem like we're asking them to eat their vegetables. It's meant to be something more joyful and more participative. And the work that we've done over the years has always been about creating spaces for citizens to interact with government, for civil servants and policymakers to understand that there can be energy in a conversation with citizens that is not negative, that does allow people to have different sorts of conversations, but also, as a policymaker, with all of the responsibilities that you sit with, to understand the different perspectives that people have and to hear for the first time something you've never heard before and come out of that room thinking, wow, yeah, that really changes my mind. A lot of that is a very social process. I think sometimes when people are talking about democratic innovations, there's an expectation that there's a kind of response that is directly answering every point. But in practice, the real richness of democratic conversations, like any conversation, is that you both leave the conversation changed a little bit, and you can't quite tell how. So citizens leave feeling that they've made a bit more, they have a better understanding of how the world works. They've been involved in something they wouldn't normally be involved in. And policymakers leave the conversation feeling that they've actually rooted what they're doing in the vision of the world that these people have, but also that they can see the impact that they're having on people from day to day. And I think that's really powerful. I think the digital tools that we have, uh, as Wada mentioned, I'm going to be focusing a little bit on the digital world. I think the digital tools we have given us a false promise in several ways. The first false promise is that they've given us the assumption that it can be easy. And I remember, so I grew up just as the World Wide Web was getting prominent. So I was at university in 1992 when the World Wide Web launched, and I was in the group of optimists who thought that this was going to be a really great thing and that we were going to reduce the barriers to democratic participation, we're going to reduce the barriers to democracy, there's going to be all sorts of fascinating new experiments that can take place. And in fact, I have a book from about 1995 still at home, pride of place on my bookshelf, called Democracy Beyond the Barricades, which talked about the post-1989 world and imagined a future where everyone was participating in democracy all the time. Now, I run a democracy organization. I don't want to participate in democracy all the time because I have a family and a football club to support. But at the same time, that vision of reducing the barriers to democracy was one of the false promises of technology. It reduced the barriers to communication, but it didn't reduce the barriers to democracy. And the problem with the ease of communication, to go with all the many brilliant things about the ease of communication, finding people that you've never thought you'd meet again, creating networks that would otherwise never exist. Alongside that, there was also the sense that you could say anything, you could do anything, and perhaps all the things you said were just, well, that was your political contribution. People spent hours on Twitter, now hours on Blue Sky, thinking they were making a political contribution, but just putting content into the machine. And I suppose, although I will talk about the benefits of digital, I promise, I suppose the thing that worries me now about the digital scene is that having reduced the barriers to communication but not reduced the barriers to democracy, we now see a risk of artificial intelligence creating a massive irresponsibilization of the democratic process. So not only can you generate text to throw into an empty debate, a machine can generate the text to throw into an empty debate for you. Or maybe you can go and find inaccurate information. If democracy as an effort is finding what you need to do as a citizen and understanding the information you need to take decisions, whether as a policymaker or a citizen, the risk is that AI gives us bad information, while communications technology enables bad communication far more than enables good communication. So the technological perspective is a lot darker than I thought it would be when I was an enthusiastic young undergraduate in 1993. But at the same time, it has created the opportunity to make connections that we haven't made before. And I think the connections and the network building are absolutely essential. And if we can build that power, particularly at the European scale, I think we will be able to make a huge difference to how democracy can develop into the future. Because from my perspective, the most important thing about democracy is effort and action. But we can't make a difference here at a European scale in a way that a citizen would necessarily be able to understand. So if we want a broad democracy, we need to have a local democracy. But if we want an effective democracy, we need a European democracy, particularly given the number of decisions that are taken at the European scale. And for me, the only way that you can make the connections that make that work is through digital technology. Now, you can hear from my voice that I'm a native English speaker, but at the same time, I can understand far more about what's happening in Europe, in German, in Spanish, in Swedish, in languages I don't speak, than I could do even a few years ago, thanks to machine translation. I have a team in Spain, I have a team in Berlin, and Democratic Society works in every country in Europe, and we have teams in 8 countries. I'd never have been able to do that without digital technology. So there's plenty of really positive things. But from a citizen's perspective, we have to refocus on the need to take action and to take effort in your local communities. And part of the benefit of digital technology is to understand how we can join those together. And I'm not coming here to say, here's the answer. I don't know what the answer is, but after about 20 years running DemSoc, I've got the question. And the question is, how do we enable people in their communities to make a difference at every level of government? So how do we understand the multi-level nature of this participation? And how do we join up the local and the issue-based conversations in ways that create active, effective democratic spaces where people are actually able to step in and make a difference and feel that they have, and all of the positive aspects of that democratic conversation, meeting people you wouldn't otherwise meet, feeling that you have a common purpose, seeing how you sit in relation to your county, your region, your country, and Europe. All of those things can be achieved if we are able to create a locally acted, digitally enabled, and digitally mediated democracy. Thank you very much. I can catch you. No, that's fine. No, I was going to make a couple of points, but I can make them later.
Well, with that, we have our third speaker, which is Ben Eersels, Executive Director of the G1000. The G1000 was already referenced, but you're in a way a trendsetter, or you broke ground for democratic innovation, or at least the G1000 did a while ago, but also more recently under the previous government. I'm happy to hear more about that, but also definitely about any other thinking you have after attending today. Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah, it seems so. Hello, everyone. I had prepared a little starting part about democratic backsliding. I will not talk about this more right now because I have the feeling that the doom and gloom has been quite well analyzed this morning. So I'm not going to go too much into that again. I just want to stress that, like everyone, there is a big sense of urgency that needs to be addressed, of course. There's one irony that I would like to point out, particularly with these people around. I think it's very telling that the country that once accepted Hannah Arendt to go work there is now currently purging academics to other countries. And I think it's unfortunately a sign of things in the US going in the very bad direction, which also, of course, influences what we are doing here in Europe. If autocrats in Europe see that in the US the bar is lowered, they feel emboldened. They get extra arguments to defend their own issues, their own policies, and that's something to definitely be very mindful for and remain very mindful for. However, I do think that there are still small lights of hope on the horizon, and maybe that's something that I would like to talk about a little bit before moving into a few suggestions that may be interesting or not interesting for this audience. First of all, I think that democracies can bounce back. One of the cases that's been that has been most optimistic in this case is Poland, of course, where recently it seems that in spite of an extremist and anti-democratic government taking power and eroding the institutions, things have been able or are starting to change back. Thankfully, there was still a strong civil society present. That's going to be a crucial factor, I think. I'll get back to that later, but it shows that democracies can bounce back. Secondly, I think that there's also a momentum now, and a momentum for collaboration that's increasing. I think at least the crisis in democracy that everyone is facing now more than ever, and even after the election of Trump and what's happening in Ukraine, even more than ever, more and more European nations at least are feeling that they need to stick together and that they need to collaborate in the face of what's happening. And you can also see that citizen support for the EU and EU collaboration is actually slowly increasing over the past years. Doesn't mean at all that we are there, and it doesn't mean that we should just stick to what we're doing, but it shows that there is something to build on. And also the EU seems to start realizing very gently that it needs to act and some things need to happen. EU lately has done some work on democracy with the Defense of Democracy package. They are currently working on a democracy shield, which should include some measures to improve democracy all over Europe. But that being said, what I understand from it is that that framework is probably a bit limited to actually do something more structural about democracy. And I think the image that they use, democracy shields, is very telling. It reflects a bit the image that democracy is something that is achieved, that's been mentioned a few times by previous speakers, and that once it's achieved, it should just be defended from outside influence. And of course, I'm not saying that that should not happen. It's very clear in Romania that there are serious threats that can really hinder democracy. But that doesn't mean that everything that's behind the shield is necessarily functioning well. I was talking about this earlier this week with a Hungarian colleague who said, well, whatever's behind the shield in my country certainly needs a bit more than just being shielded more from whatever foreign influence could have an impact on. So we don't need to just shield democracy, I think. We first of all need to repair it as well in some parts. That means media that needs to be supported, independent media. That means legal institutions that need to be supported. And that means electoral procedures, of course, that need to be supported. But thirdly, and that's the topic I think of this panel, is that democracy should be improved as well. And I think lots of things should improve, but citizen participation can be one of those things. And it can be a very hopeful story as well, I think. Bart has just mentioned it already. In Belgium, there's been some interesting work happening in the past few years. It started off in 2011 by a big citizens initiative, the G1000, 1,000 citizens that were hosted in Brussels to talk about the future of Belgium, grassroots initiative organized by a few volunteers at the time. but leading to the establishment of an organization that I'm now leading, and most importantly, leading to several governments that are now employing structural citizen participation as part of their policy making. Most notably, in East Belgium, a community of only 80,000 inhabitants, so a medium-sized city in most countries, has established the first permanent citizens dialogue in the world in 2019, the East Belgium model. And I am more than willing to say that not all citizen participation processes go necessarily well, but there it's one of the best working cases that I have seen in the world. In Europe as well, there's been a few of those initiatives, and I think this needs to build on further. We've had the Conference for the Future of Europe, which was a big one-shot initiative, not necessarily leading to a lot of policy impact, but then subsequent initiatives that worked around more structured policy files. And that brings me to two wishes that I would like to share with you, and before ending my talk here and to kick off the discussion, I think. Two wishes that I would hope that can be part of the step forward for democracy to flourish further, or at least to improve further in Europe. Not claiming, like Anthony said, that this will be the solution to solve everything, but I hope that it can be a step in a good direction. I think, first of all, the EU needs to step up. And with step up, I mean the EU needs to act more when democracies within Europe, mostly, are being attacked. They should act when, like in Hungary, institutions are openly being attacked. And there's a lot of people who know a lot better than me what kind of levers could be used or not be used by the EU. But as a citizen, I can only say, whenever very flagrant things have been happening in the EU institutions usually found a way to act. And I think that's something that should happen in this particular area. I would hope as well that the EU takes the initiative in the next few weeks to not just do a communication on what they think that democracy should look like, but that they take the initiative to put a lighthouse forward in a few years. That it's not just a communication that comes out of the democracy shield, but a trajectory towards an honest reflection about what democracy in Europe should look like, combined with concrete policy recommendations and action plans that the EU and the member states should undertake in the next few years. We always say in Europe, one of our values is democracy, but I think we really need to work again at telling that story better and explaining and just making up our minds on what democracy actually means in the EU. And secondly, my second wish, and I think this concerns a lot of the people that are here, is that I think that civil society also needs to step up its game. There are a lot of people here and a lot of organizations that are doing really great work, but we are working too dispersed, I think. And we should never underestimate, I think, the power of civil society organizations to change things in democracy for the better. I've mentioned Poland already, but in Belgium, G1000 initiative has been able to put democratic innovation on the agenda. In the Netherlands, public intellectuals and a coalition of civil society organizations have also put this on the agenda and made sure that democracy is evolving, at least slowly, with very small initiatives, mainly on the local level, but at least things are changing thanks to bottom-up engagement. We should not underestimate our powers, but we should not overestimate our ability to do things individually as well. And I think we are doing that too much for now. Just think about it. If the EU institutions want to talk to someone about what democracy should do, who do they call? I don't know, to be honest. And I think as European civil society organizations working on democracy, that's a question that we need to answer. I've been relatively hopeful, and this is where I'll end my talk, but I just want to stress that this does not mean that we should be complacent and just let the tide proceed. It's not a time to be complacent, but hopefully there are a few lights that we can think about and work towards to make sure that things change for the better and not for the worst. Thank you.
Time is flying by indeed, and I know that our next speaker has to leave soon due to an emergency behind the scenes. So I'll immediately pass her the floor. Marie-Hélène Boulanger, Deputy Director for Rule of Law, Fundamental Rights and Democracy at the Directorate General of Justice of the European Commission. I think you've had some clear questions or remarks from the Belgian side, so I'm happy to hear how the EU is approaching this issue.
Thanks a lot, first of all, for inviting me to this very nice event. So very happy to be here. I would like to start with the basics. So the basics is that for me, the European Union is founded on basic values, and democracy is one of them. I think we have heard the marvelous speakers before me. They've set the scene, and I think we have heard about why do we need democracy, which for me is an important point. And beyond what all has been said, I think it's also because it's conducive to the public good, to the public interest. So, and I think we need to keep this very much in mind. What is the essence of our democracy as being commonly understood? I don't want to speak about definition and whatever, just what is the essence. It's a space also where citizens can freely express their views, when they can participate in the democratic life, when they can choose the political representative. And I would like to insist on where they exercise their voting rights. And I haven't heard that much about electoral rights, but I always insist on that. The first thing is voting rights. The rest is also extremely important, but people are elected and our government are the people we elect. And so I have a lot of respect for all, and I will come back to that. There are many tools to have an inclusive democracy, but you should never, never lose sight about the fact that there is a common responsibility about who is being elected. And this is all of us. In a democracy, and a lot has been said, but I would like to repeat that, people can express their opinion. They should have a kind of democratic space, and we have heard about all the challenge. They must be able to have access to reliable information. Political views can be confronted, and that's something we have lost a bit in the current space. We have a bit more this fragmented world. I like very much the point about people should listen to each other. This is something which is also extremely important. People can disagree, but the importance that you can exchange. And you should be able to do all this without any interference or undue influence. We have obviously taken democracy for granted, and we have heard about the challenge around us. And it has been said public trust is so important, and sometimes the behavior can look at very short time, but you need to look at the impact on the long-term public trust in democracy, but also public trust in institutions. I've heard from someone, I don't remember whom, the importance of the efforts, and I could not agree more. Democracy is not stable. It's not time zero. It's something that you need to constantly nurture, protect, and promote all the time, and it will never, never stop. So, and who has to do that? All of us. Also the EU institution, but all of us. This is our common responsibility. And I think that's super important to keep this view that we're all a role to play by exercising our voting rights, by taking part in participative democracy exercise, but we are all there together. Now, obviously, the European Union functions with attributed competence. The bulk of responsibility on many topics regarding election, for instance, this is national competence. That does not mean we should do nothing, and we do things. And I would like to today, looking at you for the timing, to get back a bit in history and to say a bit what we have done in the previous mandate and this mandate. And I take the opportunity to say that for me, it started not the previous mandate, at least my work on democracy, but the mandate before, and you will remember, in this wonderful building where we already started to work at very high level on colloquium on democracy, on media, etc. So this work started, I would say, more than 10 years ago at very high political level, the European Union. In the current geopolitical context. We look at democracy, we look at prosperity, and we look at security. Those are important points in the action of the current Commission, as repeatedly underlined by the President of the Commission. What did we do during the previous mandate? And I would like to take a step back. Democracy was already a headline ambition of the previous Commission. We had very important, I would say, framing discussion, the document framing the discussion, focusing on election integrity, on how to best support plural media, free and plural media, and on disinformation. And we also looked in this context already at meaningful and inclusive citizens' participation and engagement, including in the context of the Defense of Democracy package, where we came with a dedicated recommendation on participation of citizens in the policy and addressed to member states. So it was really about all Europe, but also how to best go about free and fair election in Europe. And we're building on a lot of cooperation with member states. And last but not least, we came with a proposal on interest representation on behalf of third country. What is interest representation? Those are these activities by economic actors impacting decision-making process and regulatory process in the EU. And we look at common standard there. And why do I insist a bit on that? Because when we speak about the democratic sphere and the activities on the democratic sphere, we look especially at three topics, which is the impact on electoral process, the impact on legislative and regulatory process, and the impact on decision-making process. And we have different tools and instruments. I will not have the time to go into all of them, but it's the center of gravity. Obviously, all our actions are enshrined in respect for fundamental rights and democratic value. That's key because this is our DNA. This is very, very important. And I hear sometimes comment on freedom of speech, whatever. Obviously, this is part of the Charter for Fundamental Rights. Freedom of expression is key, and it has two sides. We can express ourselves freely in a democracy, but citizens should also be able to find the information they need to exercise their right in a fair democratic sphere. About the current mandate, what I would like to say is that I don't completely agree with my predecessor because a lot of what he has said, in fact, is in our work on the democracy shield. So we look at different areas of engagement. We have an ongoing public consultation, and I would like to invite you to look at our your website because it closed on Monday, on what should be in the democracy shield. And please engage. If you have views, engage, because we looked at extremely carefully with a colleague from the research part of the Commission. And we look at many, many different areas. And I would like to mention the key one. Respect the time. Okay, I get a bit of additional time, if I understand correctly. So first of all, regarding the area, one which is very important is the one which has been mentioned, which is about the societal resilience, the preparedness, and also how to foster citizens' participation engagement. So, and there we look at many areas. I mentioned turnout, but it's not only that. It's also how to empower citizens to find their way in democracies in the European Union. It's about critical thinking. It's about digital literacy. It's also about media literacy, but it's also about why does democracy matter? So how do we communicate about democracy? It's something that starts young and lifelong, and it's all age, and we need to actively go there via formal, informal, non-formal education. And sport, for instance, culture, all opportunities are good to discuss about our democracy. We should not keep that, I would say, behind a small circle. This is about all of us. So that's what we are looking at in terms of participation. We look at the empowerment of citizens. You mentioned a lot about the new technologies. I think I will not say too much about what you already said. You mentioned it too, but just to insist that obviously we look at this innovation. Democracy is in movement, and it's very important to look at these new tools. The citizens panels, the youth dialogue, where what we see, we can engage directly with people who are not so much in politics. Those are really direct interaction, which are very important. Citizen panels, they also allow people who are not so much in politics to sit together, to exchange, to confront ideas with, I would say, privileged information to better understand what is at stake. We also look at the checks and balance and democratic framework. Civil society has been mentioned. Obviously, this is a key pillar of the checks and balances of democracy. We will dedicate action plan on that. And the importance of their work has been underlined, and I can only underline again the importance. It goes beyond, obviously, it's also about media. You are very much aware about the challenge for new media, not new media, for media to have qualitative information. The economic models are complex. How do you keep free and plural media in the new environment? It's not only that, it's also research, science. How do we inject science and research, trustworthy research and science in the democratic debate about fact-based policies, etc.? How can we really get that and include that in our democratic discussion? Third is obviously about the fairness of our electoral process. I started with election. This is very central to our democracy. We have a lot of cooperative framework and action with member states on that. Again, I could reply, but no time for that. I would like to underline 2-3 points. We work with member states on preparedness for election, risk matrix, to really benefit from this common knowledge, how to best go about this new challenge in a, I would say, structured way. We also look at safety in politics, safety of candidates, but safety of elected representatives, because obviously it's some group cannot enter in politics or leave politics because they are being challenged or threatened. This is not about democracy, and it's not a question of weakness. It's a question of really being empowered, and I insist. So if you have to be threatened, or if there is violence all the time, or children are threatened, obviously you need to make hard choice and you don't engage in politics. Another topic which is important is also equality of opportunities in the electoral competition. So in traditional media, there were this, I can speak 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, this party. No, the new ecosystem, this is completely challenged because we look at complete different realities. And how do you keep these equal opportunities between candidates in electoral? Provides good replies to that, but why do I get this message? Where does it come from? Who is paying that? And is it a political ad or is it just genuine information? Last but not least, we also look collectively with all member states how to make ourselves more efficient collectively regarding FIMI, which is foreign manipulation of information and disinformation, including in terms of situational awareness. So how do we collectively better know? And also how do we make ourselves more operational? Obviously, this implies a lot of streamlining, trust between member states, taking into account all the respective competence. How many seconds do I still have? It's 4 o'clock, I will have to leave. I will just conclude with 2-3 words to say first, trust. Democracy, it's about trust. And we need to really look at how to keep this trust, foster this trust nurture distress, and we also to address real problems. It's not about artificial discussion. An important point is also looking at the problem of the people. It has been said, but I would like really to repeat that. Also the preparedness. So this thing about how can we nurture democracy, but also prepare and organize ourselves to look in the future about that. The collective exercise and the collective responsibility in a whole of society approach is essential, and be reassured that on the Commission side, this is extremely high on the agenda. Thanks a lot.
Marie-Hélène has agreed to 1 or 2 questions. Keep them very brief, and I hope to get a high quality one to let her leave on a high note. Who dares?
In case you have,
Yeah.
no, sure. Yeah, you went there this morning, but there was a speech from Roger Bexley, politics is back. My question to you is, I see all what we do, the Commission is doing about democracy. The question is, can you identify, conflate being pro-EU and being democratic? So I'm just questioning you about how we treat those who are deemed to be anti-EU and those who are pro-EU. How does this align with the fact that we have democracy at the core of our values? And that was also one question we heard this morning about, can we put the extremes out of the democratic spectrum? So what do you do of this structural fact?
Obviously, I don't represent the College of the Commission, but I can say at least what we do at my level is that in a democracy, you can disagree. There is no problem. You can disagree about how the EU function, you can seek for improvement, and this is part of a sound democratic debate. But what is important is that we create this environment where this can be done on the basis of reliable information. So that's something which can exist. It would not be a democracy any longer if people cannot disagree. You can disagree, you can seek for improvement, and it's part of a sound democratic debate. And that's something we need to listen to. You mentioned yourself that it's important to listen, understand where people come from. What is difficult if there are, for instance, artificial behavior behind this. So things which are artificial conduct, so that people basically, it's not about freedom of expression, but it's a kind of campaign triggered by artificial behavior, opaque, things like that. And that's a different story. But the fact that you disagree is part of your freedom of expression. People can disagree in a democracy, but you need to confront you in a fair and balanced manner.
10 seconds for a very short last question over there.
Yeah, you mentioned safety in politics, and I'm a local councillor in the Netherlands, and I, as a white man, have not been offended so much. But colleagues from a lot of different municipalities from all over the political spectrum get harassed on US platforms all the time. And I wonder, after years of showing that it's not even trying, that they are not even trying to abandon it, but it's actually in the system to encourage these sort of misogynistic messages, why don't we just kick them out of the EU with a bit more force?
Understood it.
I was not sure I got your question correctly. I cannot reply to all of this like that, but what I can say is that beyond what you say, I've been working on a strategic lawsuits against public participation. And before going there is a lot which can be done. This, I don't know where we are, honestly, that's beyond my pay grade. But what I've seen working on strategic lawsuits against public participation, which are basically these lawsuits against journalists and right defenders, is that this community behind people, supporting the people, giving them the necessary tools to resist, etc., is also important. I remember having heard some journalists, when you are alone in face of a threat or you get insults on social media every day, and you are alone, this is extremely difficult and extremely hard. When you start to build a community, you start to have practice, you have training, etc., there is something we can do about it. And I would insist on this element too. The rest, as I said, I need to further understand your question and the consequence of it, but this, don't let people alone when they're facing threats, being women, being other group, it's an important, and also promote a culture, I would say, of respect. Again, this is a collective responsibility, but David mentioned also, I think you mentioned a bit this vocabulary, etc. We should also reflect collectively and discuss also with all the different authorities, what is this culture of respect to allow this exchange? You ask about disagreeing. Disagreeing is completely fine, but you disagree, I would say, with a respect, listening to the others. And it's not by insulting people on social network that you show this respect. But that's something which is more about ethic, etc. And we need to keep this very much in your mind. But this has been said by my predecessor also. Thanks a lot.
Well, on behalf of the audience and all of the organizers, thanks a lot for your presence and best of luck.
Thanks. And apologies that I have to leave, and sorry this was not foreseen.
Okay, so we still have at least 40 minutes to go. And I think we would have loved to interrogate the Commission a lot more, but I have 3 other distinguished speakers who remain at your availability. And I want to ask them a few questions before I give you the opportunity to ask some. But this morning, in one of the audience's reaction to one of the interventions, we heard that we need to re-emphasize that we need to approach individuals as rational in their political decision-making. But I was kindly guided my attention towards an article from the speaker on my right about political agents as relational selves. So there you make the argument, Nicole, that we cannot just see people as only rational, but also relational. And I think that's a very important realization. Perhaps you could discuss it at a bit more length, but also further down in the article. And I'm going to quote, you make the following analysis, which I think resonates with a lot of the statements we've been hearing today, and also to which we have heard some responses already. I quote, "Invisibility and ungraspability of action may be at the core of the aporia of modern political regimes, where citizens in the role of an audience are tasked with watching and judging political rule from the outside rather than doing it for themselves. Should this be considered per se as a shortcoming, or instead a fact of life that cannot be overcome?" This is, I think, a very relevant question, and I'm not going to answer it myself. I'm going to challenge the speakers around me to provide a reaction to it, because should this be considered a shortcoming or a fact of life that cannot be overcome? I think we also have 2 people amongst the panel who are formulating some kind of actions that could be seen as addressing this question, as closing a gap, but perhaps it's not just a gap. So I really hope to get some reactions to this. Then secondly, I have a question specifically for Anthony, because Ben, you mentioned civil society needs to get their act together, or at least they need to step up and they need to become more coordinated in their action. You didn't mention it yet, Anthony, but both Democratic Society and Egmont are part of a European consortium, or even beyond Europe, which is Nets for Them, and exactly aims at bringing democratic actors closer to each other in their action and their outreach. So I think it's highly relevant to shortly react to this. And then, Ben, also one for you. Who does the EU need to call when they want to speak with the member states? If I understood correctly your question. we discussed this privately, but in the previous Belgian federal government, there were two ministers who had democratic innovation as part of their portfolio. Perhaps as a practitioner, you might give us a short evaluation of how this progressed the cause. How do you evaluate the fact that we had two ministers in charge of this file? So I think a few elements that the three of you can react to, and I'm agnostic on who goes first.
Can I just clarify a little bit before Anthony weighs in? When I was talking about civil society that needs to step up its act, I meant as democracy organizations. We do a lot of capacity building and network building together, and that's great. But I think we have a lot to win from speaking with one voice, and with one voice in terms of our advocacy towards European and national, mainly European in this case, organizations. So just to clarify that that was mainly what I was trying to get at.
Okay, so the starting point, let me try and answer both of those questions together, because for me, I think the aporia that Nicole identifies is partly about the distance between the citizen and the decision maker, but is also, I think, between that to some extent there has always been that distance. If you think about the way in which people existed hundreds of years ago, they didn't feel any more engaged with the decisions that the king was taking than people do today. But they had other structures of identity and of value, whether it was they thought they were doing the right thing by God, or they thought they were doing the right thing by their community, or whatever it was. So there was maybe something more immediate, but it wasn't political, it wasn't democratic. I think to some extent the aporia that we see is almost the government and political system not keeping up with expectations of agency and expectations of individualism and control that are moving faster than government institutions can move, and that are requiring changes to government institutions that are very complicated, because every governing institution, someone called it an algorithm, it's also a massive compromise. As I said before, I grew up in the UK, and one of the things that was really noticeable about the UK debate on Europe during the Brexit period was that the UK press and politicians and people who are quite educated about how politics worked always used to say things like, well, why can't the EU just be a bit more flexible on this, that, or the other? Why can't we have some sort of special deal? And the answer, of course, which never seemed to be understood, was that the deal that the EU had with itself was already a deal, and a really complicated one that had been negotiated through multiple rounds. So all of those political systems, I'm Belgian now as well as British, so I understand both sorts of complicated political systems. They're all the consequences of compromise, and undoing that compromise is an enormous political move in itself. So one of the things I think we need to understand is, how do we shape the political systems that have generated this aporia, or where that aporia is being generated by the mismatch of expectations between citizens and system, in a way that doesn't collapse the system while we're doing it. I described it the other day to somebody as, it's a bit like doing a jigsaw, but you're not doing a jigsaw at your dining room table with a cup of tea next to you. You're doing a jigsaw running along a mountain ledge in the dark, in the rain, and there are dogs behind you. And it feels like that kind of pace of change is very, very hard for political systems to manage. And taking up the Nets for Dem point, one of the things that we've seen is this great flourishing of democratic innovation. And G1000 is one example. We've been working for 20 years, and I don't think I've ever seen as much going on in terms of democratic participation and experimentation. And I think that that's a really positive thing, but we still haven't understood how to get over the kind of adoption chasm, how to get from a place where these initiatives are happening at the edge of the system and sometimes having influence, to these systems being integrated into the way that government works and into the way that politics works. And in that context, one of the reasons for creating the Networks for Democracy and Nets for Dem project that we have, generously funded by the Horizon Europe project of the European Union, is exactly to try to understand how can we create the alliance of people outside the system who can change the system within. So the fundamentals of it are, we saw, as part of our thinking about it, that policymakers and academics and practitioners didn't have enough opportunities to talk to each other. And that sounds like a really simple thing, but it meant that the we all had different and mismatched understandings of what it meant to be one of those things. Now, I'm unusual in that I've been both a policymaker, 14 years in government, and a practitioner, 15 years running democratic society. And I've never been an academic. Maybe that comes next. But I think that the reason that we created the network was to try to understand how do you bring the conversation together in such a way that when the moment comes for a new proposal, a new system, some reform, the ideas are there, and we've got the coalition in place to help make it happen. Now, it's very early days. I don't think this is something that is going to be done by people writing a single document in a room. It's about a cultural shift as much as it's about a structural shift. But part of the thing that we have to get across, part of the chasm that we have to jump, is from assuming that democratic participation beyond elections is something new and experimental, and we have to see how it works, to really embedding it in the way in which we think about how politics is done. Because I think only that way are we going to be able to move politics as fast as people's expectations of agency are moving. And that, for me, is the solution that's at hand to the aporia that Nicole quite rightly identifies in the paper.
Ben or Nicole, who?
Yeah, I can briefly react and then go to your other questions. So I think that's great. And my hope is just that we, as democracy organizations, we come up with a common voice and a common advocacy strategy. Again, that's the word that I stress, quickly, because there's a momentum right now, and we sometimes have the impression there's different philosophies and different ways to approach democratic innovation and citizen participation. And I feel that we are sometimes getting lost a bit too much in the different approaches instead of trying to see what kind of strategy could be used to be most effective at our political work. Coming to your question, Wart, about an evaluation about where Belgium's at, indeed. The last term, we had not one, but even two ministers of democratic innovation. There has been some important legislative work being done on institutionalizing citizen participation at federal level. It's now possible within the chamber and in the Senate to organize citizen panels and mixed committees as part of parliamentary work. And I think that's very important in terms of laying the groundwork for citizen participation that can come. Furthermore, Belgium, I think, is one of the first countries that has issued a sortition bill that also makes using these recruitment procedures a lot more efficient and cheaper and effective. So that's all important work. There's been some few first experiments on citizen panels that have been organized in the context of the Conference for the Future of Europe. There's been one on AI that's also been organized in the context of the European presidency, one on just transition that Anthony has been involved in. And I have the feeling that there we are at the stage of the first experiments that are happening, but that we are still looking for ways to really connect that to policy making in a more efficient level, which in a more structural level, I'm going to say, for instance, what's happening in East Belgium. That's the past. Where are we at right now? As I understand it, the former minister of democratic innovation, of one of the former ministers, is coming to speak later, so we can ask her that question. Unfortunately, there's no minister of democratic innovation. I'm talking about Annelies Verlinden. There's no minister of democratic innovation in this term. Unfortunately, that may seem to indicate that there is a bit less ambition to structurally continue that work. But as I said, the groundwork has been laid. The legal things are there, and hopefully they will still be activated in the next few years.
Very shortly to open the floor. I think we focus too much, if I may say, on system and not enough on agency. System and instruments and methods, where I think that what Arendt brings us is that if we change our entrenched assumption and we embark her conceptualization of humanness, for example, around what the human condition is and where we have action together with its two brothers or sisters, work and labor. So Arendt provides way to look differently at the same reality. And what I experienced when I was in the commission was that you can even change alone the way you look at things, and that push people around you. It's not a landslide change, of course, but at least you form a different conversation around you. So it's also, so what Arendt brings is really a way to, if you embark her proposals around plurality, natality, her new way to define power, freedom, really, you can give rise to a different unfolding from where we are. So I would insist on looking not only at systems, but how we can embark ready-made concepts and make them work in the current system and reality. And because what is partly wrong is that our trust in systems and methods is too big, and we forget that we are seen for what we are. When we are speaking of deplorables this morning, it's not only that the one pronouncing this sentence was a candidate to the in the election, but it is that in fact we speak of others, this we lose the sense of how we are perceived by others, that deplorables have a brain, that people without education have a full brain. So all these people are seeing us as we are and not as we would like to be seen. This is nothing to do with social networking, with easiness or whatever, nothing with democracy shield communication. If we don't embark that we are seen as who we are by those looking at how we operate these institutions that we are part of. If we don't bring that into our own reasoning, and if we don't bring more decency in our behavior, and I mean, I don't think any system can solve the problem. But sorry.
Thanks a lot for those reactions. So now, as promised, I give the opportunity for some questions from the floor, and I'm very happy to see some of our speakers from this morning. I'll first go there and then to you.
Thank you very much for this interesting panel and all the ideas that came up, and all your work that you're doing actually in practice to transfer something of the theory into practice. One observation or the one question is whether it's useful to distinguish between politics looking at the representation role in power, the representation role of governments and in the EU, the system part of it, which would suggest that we're looking more at the power relationship. We look here more on the power relationship of politics. But if you were to look at politics as a cultural activity, as something that is natural in each community, because we are part of so many different, we can be part of so many clubs, or we can be in a housing council. I mean, the politics in a housing council is probably really, really tough. You need a lot of skills there. And the question is, if you are thinking of teaching or promoting politics, is that not something to be taken into account for? That it is actually a wider activity, and if you teach people the skills and the tools of how to do this, how to actually be in these confrontational roles, and actually how to figure out how can we resolve and figure out all these differences, that is as such a valuable tool and for everyone. It doesn't mean that they actually all go voting, or they all go and actually relate to the power of the institutional power representation that we are looking at. The other question was about language. I mean, we talked about Nicole, you talked about the language of war. That too, I realized when I did my studies, the language of war is something that is inherent in our culture. We actually don't know how to speak the language of peace. And I think it was, for me, it was one of the shocking realizations. We don't know how to talk peace without being seen as weak. It looks very weak if we talk and use the vocabulary of peace. And this is something that may be a phenomenon of a culture of fear that is based on fear rather than of trust and nurturing and confidence. But it definitely is something, is for me a puzzle. How do we get from this place to the other? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Also, for me, this panel is very interesting because it is exactly what we often lack, namely the contact between academia, research, and practitioners and people that work in the field, in the local communities, and I found very inspiring all of your talks. And going back to this aporia, of which I believe Nicole and Zakharevsky were talking about, yes. So I will move from being an Arendtian scholar studying Arendt for probably 25 years to go back to as a citizen, as an active political citizen who is active at the local level in her community. I live in a small town in northern Italy, and I engage in political activity, namely in civic local politics, trying to do cultural events, but also supporting civic, how do you say, when we have local elections, you could either have a party or you could have just a civic list yeah. So I often support, I have supported the civic lists of friends that were a candidate and then got elected. One of the major problems that I experience as a person, as a citizen, is the total distrust that people have, even in local politics. That when you go and talk to them saying there is a local civic list that is willing to take the municipality, or how you call it, the town, and I'm speaking here in very simple terms, but the feeling is that they perceive you as you want to sell them something. They perceive you as a local seller of pottery or something. And I have not found a way to overcome this, which is is a very prosaic aporia, if you want, because even at the local level, people have a distrust in the election action, be it at the local level or at the national level. They have a distrust because they immediately interpret politics as sphere of, you know, affairs where somebody gains something. And I haven't overcome this, even if I have been studying Arendt in terms of participatory practices for many, many years. And the other thing that I want to ask you, if you have an answer to this, is the fact that most citizens, at least in northern Italy, northern developed Italy, richest part of the country, beside the distrust is the lack of time. I mean, people don't have time. So their lives are so fully saturated by work or by entertainment or by something else. And the time that you would reserve for politics or for political action or for civic engagement is always perceived as like the last time that you dedicate to something. Not for everybody, of course, but for the majority of the people. So what I find that needs to be done is a radical cultural shift that, of course, doesn't come in a minute, because it's the cultural shift that you need to provoke in people, and because they will always, as Machiavelli says, love their souls more than they love the republic. So how do you I'm asking you, like, what would be the best strategies to change this attitude? That is a liberal effect. This is a depoliticization of which Roger was speaking. Thank you.
Do you want me to come back on that? So that's an extremely rich question, probably several PhDs worth. But my very rough answer is that I do understand. I mean, the point about people don't trust politicians because they feel like they have something to sell is not entirely untrue. They do have something to sell. They've got themselves or a party or something like that. So there is a kind of natural skepticism that comes from that. Um, People's relationships with their friends, particularly when it comes to local politics, can be difficult. I remember when I was doing some work in a rural area in England, they have a system in England where if you have a local council, like at a village level, if you have elections, you get more money for the council. But if you don't have elections, if you only co-opt people by nominating them, then you don't get much money. You just like do little bits and pieces. And I asked one of the quite big villages, why didn't they have elections when they were such a big village and they could really have used the money? And they said, oh, it's just very difficult because we almost had an election a couple of years ago because one person wanted to stand down and two people wanted to be chosen. But one of them would have had to lose. And, it would be really socially awkward for them to be like going around in the village thinking, oh, that's the guy who lost the election. So we asked somebody else to stand down so they could both go on the council. And that's just such a human interaction. I remember it now 15 years on because it is the kind of it's not the anti-politics, but it's the anti what people think politics is. People think politics is the backstabbing and the competition I've got to win. And in most communities, that's not that's not a great attitude to have. So I think that part of the cultural point that the person across from you was saying, part of the cultural point is understanding how do we present something as the way that the community is self-governing without using the politics word, which is all backstabbing, or even the democracy word, which sounds like a civics lesson or a sociology seminar. So we really struggle with this. I mean, my organization is called Democratic Society, right? We really struggle with it because it does sound like a sociological seminar. I think part of the question around power and around equality and around community governance is we need to thread that through the language that we use, but we do need to find a better language. And the other thing I think we need to find, and this isn't criticism of you or anyone else on the council in your area, is a better model of political leadership. Because I think we've grown up into and with a model of political leadership that is extremely top down, and that is very much about taking the hard decisions. It's not even like It's not even like many politicians are charismatic. They're just running a system. They're the person who's elected to run the machine. And so I think we do need to understand the cultural shift isn't just about everything is more open, but people at the top stay the same. It has to be everything is more open, and the vision of leadership that political leadership needs to be is about the choices that people are likely to have to make, and the philosophical vision that they set out is the one that is attractive to the people who vote in the election, rather than I'm the best manager or the other guy's a really bad manager. And I think that kind of that's an unpicking of some of the technocratic and new public management models that have really been baked into the way that lots of government agencies work. And it's not an easy process, but I do think it's part of the cultural shift is to change the structure. Part of the structural shift is to change the culture.
And this leads to the fact that Arendt has signaled herself that how much the election and representative democracy is doomed to be in a stalemate sooner or later. And I think because these electoral campaigns and in fact, is plurality malgré vous, in a sense that you appear to the people you speak to as begging. So you pretend that you ask, it's interesting for them to vote for you, while in fact you are asking them something. And this misunderstanding is something that is clear from a plurality point of view. You reveal not who you are, but what you need. And so this is a sort of distorted plurality interaction. And I think that indeed the electoral campaign are really not the best setting for enjoying plurality. And my hope is that even if you have elected people ending up in a room, I imagine the cabinet of Belgium, or as I say, the council, that you can start plurality anytime, as soon as you have a group of people on the corner of the street, or in the Council of the European Union, or at the college, or in a participatory, that every time you are around the table, however you arrive there, by election, by a mandate, by anything, by randomness, that you behave, as she says, in full knowledge that you reveal who you are when you interact with others, and that you don't need to control the outcome. You accept the outcome because others are peers, beginners as you are, and the point is not to win. So really this win or lose, the fact that now media consider election as a competition, and being in power is a price that you get. So once you are in power, it's normal that you abuse your power because you won the election. It's just a price. And then you pay the price when you step down. So there is really the way that the political life is commented is driving people nuts, frankly. And we don't need extreme right to be in power to wait for this stupid moment to be. We are there. So I really think that we need to change the way we speak about politics, not only and the way we act it, sorry. Yes. So this revelatory nature of behavior that comes with the who identity concept of Arendt, that is part of plurality, is really something that we should be aware of much more than we are.
Thanks a lot. I haven't heard a direct reaction to the first questions we received, which gets back as well to civic education, if I may say so, which we heard oftentimes today. I'll take one more question. I think Nicole will provide an answer to the first one, but yes.
I think I made myself unpopular this morning. Now I'm going to depress everybody. No, Olivia just, raised something that I remember hitting a brick wall in my own back in the day research on democracy, and it was this, and this relates to this idea of plurality, participation, and class. And, as Ollie said, I mean, one of the problems we face in having anything more than what Rousseau said, the English think they're free because once every 5 years they get out of their chains and vote. I mean, that's got in part to do with the fact that it's quite difficult to be involved in participatory democratic projects because the vast majority of people work very hard in, not great paid jobs, are exhausted at the end of the day. The last thing they want to do is use their brain power, what's remaining at the end of the day, to try and get out to a meeting or involve themselves in politics. And indeed, unless we consider that, what we actually end up with in more participatory democratic systems is certain classes of people who have more time, who have more resources, have more cultural and social capital, are better able to participate in a democracy, and it skews the participation in favor of those with those resources, time, and everything else. Meanwhile, we're still excluding those people who perhaps would most benefit from more active engagement in politics. And what we end up with, and this is the depressing bit, is that, how do we address that? Well, we have to reconfigure the economy somehow, through, I don't know, a universal income or something else, which itself is a democratic decision, which needs to be taken before we can have a fully participatory democratic system. But we can't do that because that current system doesn't allow us to make the decision. So we end up in this kind of cycle of economics and politics, and I'm afraid I don't have an answer to it, but I'm just wondering if it's something that you face in these Belgian experiments that you've been involved in.
Other question? No.
I think we'll take these two first.
Okay.
So, Susanna.
Okay. Yeah. War versus peace. I think indeed there is this entrenched mentality, and that comes out for me of the modern trope that you have to be aggressive and to fight against the world as it is to show how your power. So there is this. Arendt, in the beginning of Human Condition, explained very well that she was astonished by the fact that people, when going to the moon, consider they want to escape the human condition. So in the modern trope, which is our legacy, there is this escapism from our human condition. So that's where the contingency and the amor mundi are really a shift. And I think Arendt shows that you can be brilliant and embracing things. You don't need to be against to be considered smart, if you see what I mean. So I think, yeah, she freed us to dare consider that you can speak of peace as something which makes sense and not be bound to speak in war terms. Yeah, I don't know if I answer your point, but I think that indeed, for the moment, when I see the warmongering, it's really worrying, and that maybe this, I don't know, is a question to Ben. Maybe when you say that you feel a push to be united and all that, if we get united on utopias, follies, disconnection with reality, I am not reassured about our unity and what it can deliver, frankly speaking. So I'm not a fan of unity, as you understood. I prefer a good management of dissent than wrongly minded consent. But so much, yeah. So I don't think I can say more on the economic and politics. I think that what is key in Arendt's point is this silk stuff that she wrote in On Revolution, where she sees that people who are beyond the threshold of society, when they have the means to survive, if they choose to stay in this accumulation mode, it's just the reversal of the misery and their own fear to be poor. And I think that as politicians, political leaders, what they did in the neoliberal years were to identify the general interest to the interests of the wealthier through the trickling down theory, we called it. And we totally forgot. We could say to the people who are ultra rich, nothing wrong with your wealth, but now that you are rich, you are free and you can contribute, instead of saying, we will do what you need to stay rich because we identify our collective being to your existence. So really, if wealthy people were contributing to what we speak of large shoulders or this expression, all this expression for me is a way to move from extreme inequalities to maybe milder inequalities. And it is not revolution, but it could bring us to a path where we again converge in terms of wealth, instead of hollowing out the middle class. And this only takes to speak differently to the people who are ultra rich, not aggressively, but just stand firm on the fact that we should not, as policymakers, prioritize their need on the need of those who are starving. I mean, anybody human can accept that people starving deserve more support than people who are doing extremely well. So that's a compass for political decision that I think could be quite consensual beyond the right-left divide.
I'll start with the question on civic education. Maybe indeed that was left out a bit. This is not my core expertise, and I know that civic education programs are slightly or starting to be used in schools, and I think that's indeed useful to learn about those democratic competences. But there's another part of this, I think, that's about learning by doing, which can even be more effective. And a few of the things that some of the colleagues of mine are working on are, for instance, school assemblies that are being organized in this particular area. And I think that's a brilliant way to teach students for the first time that, first of all, democracy is not just about voting. It can also be about participating in something, in really becoming a citizen and not just someone who is receiving input, in someone taking up responsibility themselves, learning about an issue and thinking about the public interest, in this case of the school. And I think that's an interesting tool to work with. There's Canadian colleagues of mine that are trying to address the increased feeling of fear in the new context by doing civic education programs on readiness. What can I do as a citizen when war breaks out here? What can I do to give people a bit of sense of control, which can also be, I think, part of giving people a bit of ownership and a bit of self-security about their own situation. To the comments about the gentleman, about indeed citizens that I'm trying to summarize, not all citizens willing to participate in these endeavors, because a lot of them have already jobs, and the last thing that they want to do during their free weekends is participate in citizens' assemblies or in other participatory instruments. So I partially take your point, but only partially. There is a lot of research that shows that citizens are at least intrinsically willing to be involved more in participatory processes. and in citizens' assemblies, but also in referenda, in other sorts of things. So there is a will to do this. It doesn't mean in practice that all of them show up at the day itself. That's absolutely true. But there are ways to try to get a nice mix of people nonetheless they're present. We've talked about random selection, which can give you a mix of highly educated and non-highly educated people coming from all strands of society that form in that sort much more a mirror of society than the things that you get with other processes necessarily. But I think it's also one of the reasons that, although I agree with Anthony, that with digital tools, the promise of everything is easy to participate in politics is sometimes a bit too promising. I do think we still have to look for ways to create lower thresholds of participating in processes than only these citizens' assemblies, to allow indeed for people who have a little bit more time to still have some place in the process at the end, for instance, to vote on certain proposals. And indeed, that will then be a less another engagement than these citizens' assemblies, but we have to try to find ways to also allow this. Although, of course, democracy is crucially about bringing people together around the table, and it's not just about creating policy. And to your final point, maybe about unity and managing dissent, of course, there must be dissent and disagreements about different things, but I think the key is at some point that you can try to overcome this to find a common agenda to defend together. And I think lots of things in this case can be learned from farmers associations, for instance, and environmental organizations who also don't necessarily all have the same interests that they defend, but if it comes to it, they do speak with one voice with certain policymakers, and they do find ways to still defend the common agenda. And I think there's a way forward for us in that case as well.
Yeah, just quickly. I think both questions are important in a kind of formal structure, but the importance of the informal that we've talked about is there. And one of the things that I'm quite focused on doing is understanding how we build up that informal into spaces that are traditionally occupied by formal structures. I think if you went to any poor neighborhood in Belgium or in England or wherever, yes, there are some people who are not able or willing or have the time to participate, and plenty who will not be interested in participating in something that seems a very kind of intellectual exercise. But everyone in those communities will be doing something in their community, even if it's just helping out a neighbor, and everyone will have a vision of the world. And I think our task is not necessarily to give everybody the time and financial resources to participate in formal structures, is to understand how we interlock the formal structures with people's vision of the world, and how do we create the tools that allow us to bring those perspectives forward in a respectful way without putting too much burden on people. I don't see, which I used to think in the past, I don't see a future where everyone participates all the time as desirable, let alone achievable. And I think that if we get ourselves stuck in a sort of neo-republicanism mindset where everyone has to participate, and everyone kind of has to participate as a theoretical equal, even though in practice they aren't, then I think we're really stuck. The point about economic equality and economic and access is equally a point about multilingualism here in Belgium, and is equally a point about confidence. And what we've seen in Antwerp, where there's been a lot of work done on this, is that it took them 4 years to get to a point where the self-selected group turning up for a participatory budgeting exercise was properly representative of the community. And that's 4 years of work with existing organizations, with networks of peers, with bring a friend schemes to help them understand how to go through a participatory budgeting process. Now, I'm not saying that's what has to happen everywhere, but we have to make it more natural that happens, to make it a natural part. And that's where the civic education part comes in. Because please, I beg of you, do not go to town halls and give them a picture of what happens in the Belgian electoral system. Give them the tools to enable them to express themselves in ways that are respectful and that are getting multiple different perspectives in. Because to be honest, the agency that most people want in politics is not to do something. In fact, if you ask most people what are politicians for, they'll say they're the people we pay to do the politics stuff. You need to give them the agency of being heard and of being respected for being heard and feeling like they're part of something which is making a difference in the place where they live. Now that may seem like it makes European politics totally irrelevant, but it really doesn't. We have to find the ways of making these local conversations connect into the European, and I think that can only come from an understanding that both the formal structures need to exist, and we need to increase access and awareness of that. So that's the formalism part, but also beneath that, the democratic cultures, the things that we need in community and in society and inside government, the cultures inside the institutions are just as important. To open up those productive spaces, which we don't quite know how to work yet, that's the really important part for taking us to the next step.
It's 10 to 5, so I'll take two more final questions. I have one from Nicole and then no, we can take one or two.
There are no others.
No, but we can take one or two from the audience as well. But just I promised my speakers before the panel that they could get a second intervention. I think they have had sufficient engagement with each other by now. But after the questions, I'll allow them for 2 or 3 minutes closing remarks as well, unless they need more. So I'll take a question there in the back. Sorry for not seeing you earlier.
So maybe it's more of an observation than a question, but I think we keep talking about this. Marie-Hélène said that democracy is a value. I really disagree with this because I think democracy grows out of our values. If we have certain values that we are aware of and that we share, we will relate to one another. We will behave towards one another in a different way, and that behavior gives birth to democracy. Democracy is a living structure. It was also said. It's not a scaffolding in which we operate. And depending on the speaker today, there were those that pretended like democracy is something that we're going to foist upon people, that we're going to insist on people. That's not going to work. And there was foreign intervention mentioned, Russia's a bad influence in Ukraine. Yeah, but what about the United States? Right? We don't talk about that. They're the good guys. Democracy really is something from the ground up. And I think there's occasionally in this day to day, there were real contradictions. And Nicole, I so appreciate how you keep bringing it back to what Hannah Arendt said and about reality and contingency. So I think bringing in people from the EU, that's fine. I'm a Swiss citizen. We have a very direct democracy. We are very active in how we tend that democracy still, although it's also critical that we maintain it. And I understand why a direct democracy isn't the best model, but in Switzerland it still works. And we have a healthy suspicion of the EU because ultimately democracy is about local behavior that grows out into the bigger. So that's just my comment on today.
Thank you. Do we have one last question from the room? I don't see any hands. So then I suggest, Nicole, you can ask your question to Anthony, and then for the final remarks, we will have first Anthony, then Ben, and Nicole. I propose you go last, if that's fine for you.
Yeah, the question is about, again, taking seriously the people who participate in participatory process. What is your assessment of when the outcome of this participatory process is guaranteed to be taken into account, like budgeting, where the decision maker will take what comes out of the participatory, and when is it considered that these people will enjoy having an experience, even if it doesn't lead to any concrete change. So, this patronizing approach to participatory process versus real abandonment, delegation to that process for making decision.
I think it's not entirely what's the best way of putting this? A lot of the time when power is directly delegated, it is for very numerical and structural things. So participatory budgeting is easy because you get a number at the end. A lot of more recommendation-based participation is much harder because if you look at the actual recommendations that come out, they're often very vaguely worded and don't necessarily align well with what's legally possible or structurally possible. So I think it's going to be very difficult to put in place a system, which does happen in some places, it happens in Poland, where you have a recommendation-based participation system where with 80% of people approving it, it gets kind of signed off and gets implemented, because there's always going to be margin and interpretation around implementation, which can either, which means that you get a situation where, I mean, here in Brussels, I was at two different conversations last week about the Conference on the Future of Europe. And in one of them, someone said it was really good because 80% of the recommendations were implemented. And another one said it was really bad because all of the recommendations that the politicians didn't want didn't get implemented. And these two statements are both factually true. And that's the problem about recommendation-based processes. The problem with the numerical-based processes is that you're restricted to numbers. It's a bit like, do you want to be a mathematician or do you want to be a magician? The mathematician processes is actually all in who designs the process that leads you to the number. So for example, if you have a participatory budgeting process, even the most extensive ones don't really allocate more than about 5 or 10% of budget. So you end up it's like, I let my kids spend their pocket money. Well, they're all too old now to have pocket money, but I let my kids spend their pocket money however they want because I don't care. But I wouldn't let them spend the mortgage money. And then on the other hand, the recommendations is more the magician side, where you kind of put everything into a pot and you wave your hands over it and say the magic words, and the policy comes out and you say, look, isn't that just like what you asked for? So I think there's no middle ground there. We haven't yet devised the methods that allow for a much clearer articulation of why you said, when people said this happened, other than through voting and through other mathematical type models. So that's one of the things I think we need to work on. I just don't think there's a clear example of where some middle path has worked. Should I run straight on into my final remarks? So first thing I should say is I'm really sorry I have to run out of the room at 5 o'clock because I have a family appointment in Hainaut at 6:30 and I need to get a particular train. So I'm really sorry. It's been a fantastic discussion. I'm sorry not to be able to catch up with people afterwards, but I'm the only one of these people with this name, so you just drop me a line. The thing I would say is the conversation here has reminded me how important it is that we keep both sides of this democratic participation conversation together. I think there's a lot of people who, like me, came to this from government and from a kind of process and decision-making perspective, and have had to learn, sometimes the hard way, the importance of like emotion, sociology, humanity in the way in which these decisions are taken. And there are other people who come from a community activism background who sometimes have to learn the politics and the rationality and the least worst choice that comes from having been, like me, a civil servant for 14 years of my life. I think if we hold these two things together, we'll be able to produce a much more productive debate than either arguing about processology or creating this kind of broad sense of dissatisfaction with what's happening. Because although I am dissatisfied with what's happening, and I totally understand the point about the social inequality of participation and some of the economic inequality that flows from, I don't think we can solve it all at once. I think we have to do it we have to solve it in a way that allows the existing system to maintain the essential services that it provides to the people who are our principal concern, which is the citizens of this country and this continent, while also ensuring that in the future it's able to deliver the agency and the participation and the democratic energy that people so clearly are not feeling in the current environment. So just to refer back again to the democracy shield, democracy shield's absolutely essential, but it needs to be a shield under which the new democracy can grow. So a bit like at the end of Invisible Cities, we have to find the things that are not bad and give them space and let them grow. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for being here today, Anthony, and for your insights. Ben, the floor is for the last time yours.
I'm not sure if I have a lot to add, actually. It was a very rich discussion in any case. I very much liked what you said, Anthony, about keeping those two conversations together, about culture, about institutions, about the bottom up and the policy making. And I'm just going to leave it with that, actually.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to close, I guess, with really calling on the liberal Democrats and to relax, and in the sense of not considering they're besieged by others, by aliens, and embrace the situation as it is, because we cannot do politics and pretend being Democrat in this freaking out mindset. So I'm sorry to say that again, this freaking out mindset is being perceived by all those from us and those from looking at us from the margins or the extreme, as you like to call. But I say it's really, we should relax, because that's, otherwise we sort of as we have heard, the first keynote, or the second one was to say we mimic these parties, but pretending when we do it, it's okay, when they do it, it's wrong. So it's just unreadable. And it is not only the politicians who are unreadable, but the media, who feel that they have to defend the system. So in a way that really doesn't serve the system, but only leave people like me totally orphan, if I may say, or in a difficult position. So I really make this plea for relax, trusting what is human in all people, included in the people that we don't appreciate their stance. So agree to disagree, but not within margins with conditions, but unconditionally, I think, because plurality and politics is played under the sky, not necessarily in context where we can format the interaction and control them. So there is no guarantor that things cannot be blown up, and freaking out will surely not be the best guarantee for avoiding that. So I think it's a call for democratic people to relax. Not sit back and relax, but relax to engage better with all the spectrum of with what happens, and indeed be in amor mundi, because and this joy of experiencing, this is the age we are going through. So no need to have golden age in mind, or we can have lessons from the past, but not in a regretful way, because this disempower us totally. So I really think it's urgent to, I hate this term wake up, but to step up of our straight jacket, where we don't dare thinking, we don't dare seeing what's wrong with us, we don't, and we just condemn the one that are outside the system, or and claim they want to put it down. So yeah, relax and be more efficient then.
Thanks a lot, and please, indeed. I was given the impossible task to provide some closing remarks, but I'd be doing a disservice to such a rich discussion in trying to sum it up in -3 minutes, as we're running behind schedule again, and I want to release you for your final coffee break. So I'm just for 30 seconds, perhaps 60, will abuse my position as moderator of this panel to shed a light on some of the work Egmont has been doing on democracy, to share a personal feeling about something that struck me really today. As I've mentioned before, we are involved in the Nets for Them project, which is trying to bring democracy actors and democracy action closer together. We have very good conversations and very good partnerships with organizations such as Democratic Society, such as the G1000. But our work in recent years on democracy has started with the Conference on the Future of Europe, which has been referenced a few times today. And the sentiment of the Conference on the Future of Europe, without taking a position on its outcomes or on its successes, but the sentiment around democracy that was experienced at that time was a sentiment that I heard earlier today. It's not only about being reactionary on protecting our democracy, but it should also be a joy. It's not only a responsibility to go vote, but we need to keep this momentum and have these positive conversations about the road ahead for democracy and the pressures that we are facing. So I completely join Nicole in the fact that we need to relax, but we also need, it's perhaps a euphemism or a bit too extreme, but we need to celebrate the fact that we're living in a democracy. And that's how we can stand up, by not only being reactionary, but by proactively enjoying and celebrating the fact that we are lucky enough to live in a democracy. With that, this panel has come to a close, but the day not yet. So unless I'm being struck by a lightning bolt from Christoph, in about 30 minutes, the closing ceremony of the day will take place, and the official inauguration of the Hannah Arendt Network, with, it has been mentioned, the presence of Minister Annelies Verlinden. So we have a final coffee break, but please do stick around for the presence of the minister. And if not, there's also a reception afterwards. Thanks a lot for your attention.